today it's a great pleasure to introduce Belinda, who will tell you all about her talk. But interestingly, from my perspective, we did undergrad together here at UQ. We were the first cohort of environmental science students and have since gone on to achieve great things. And that's pretty much my introduction, but it's really, I think, great that as I was walking around the corridor before, lots of people saying, yeah, I really want to go to that talk that's going to show a different perspective on the same problem where we deal with all the time. So we're really excited that you've come across to talk to us, and this kind of cross-unit collaboration and scholarship exchange is really important. So thank you. Thanks for taking the time.
It's my pleasure to be here, and I think I've been speaking to a few people from economics and business school, telling them about these workshops or weekly meetings that you have in presentations, and there's more people interested in coming. So if you want more people to come from an economics perspective or a business perspective, sort of natural capital and...
Oh, great. Yeah, because half the trouble is identifying the relevant people and the people that are interested.
Oh, exactly. So,
okay, let's keep on.
I will do my best. But thank you all for coming today. It's a privilege for me to be here and to share my PhD research with you. So I finished my PhD a couple of years ago now, so it doesn't seem that long ago. But I thought I'd start off and just give you a quick background. Yes, I did know Kerry. We worked on many group assignments together very diligently back in our undergrad degrees. And since then we sort of went divergent ways, and I went into the corporate area and worked in energy trading. So different aspects of analysis and portfolio management. I ended up managing the renewable products portfolio within Energex Retail. But while I was doing that, I guess we were always so frantically busy, I never felt like I was really getting to work on the problem and actually try and find a solution and really understand what the solution could be. So when the opportunity arose, I decided I was going to come back to UQ and do a PhD and examine exactly that. So my PhD looked at best practice carbon management. But not from a really prescriptive best practice point of view. It was more looking at areas that organisations could work on to make further progress and more accelerated progress to decarbonising their operations. So I finished that, as I said, a couple of years ago. I now lecture in the business school into the Master of Business, major in social impact and sustainability. So I lecture 2 of those courses. I also run a sustainable business program for visiting academics. So the academics come out for a 2-week program in January, and we take them all around different examples of sustainable businesses through Sydney and Brisbane. So there's quite a lot of interesting things going on within organisations once you get out there and actually they share their stories with you. And they're normally very, very willing to share their stories in this area. So I'll start off with a very quick background because I know you guys are the experts in climate change. I feel very inadequate when I stand up in my in my lectures, second week of lectures, and we go into the science of climate change, and I sit there thinking, why can't I remember more? Why don't I bring in a scientist to do this lecture instead of me? But from my perspective, it's important to understand the science, but then we need to go on and understand what those impacts are and how we can create a change. So we've got, obviously the direct physical impacts of climate change, but when we're looking from an organisational perspective, there's a huge array of hugely impactful indirect impacts. So impacts on the legal system and what's going to happen in terms of regulations, impacts on their risk management, new technologies coming in, market changes, how is the market changing for their products. And these are really challenging areas for organisations to manage, because if you think from an organisational perspective, they're normally operated on quite short-term timeframes of around 3 years. And if you think of these large-scale investments and technology changes and trying to make these changes occur, that's a really long-term perspective that organisations have to take. And then that is really challenging for organisations. So I like to step my classes when I do them through, and we say, if we're looking at making action on climate change and decarbonisation, initially, we can look at what's happening at a global perspective, and we've got the COP21 agreements and the aspirational target of 1.5 degrees. But that didn't actually give us any direction on how that would be implemented at a country level. So then within each country they have these different regulations and schemes to try and reduce their carbon emissions. But what I was researching in my PhD is at an organisational level, because although you can bring in these regulations, you know, there's still that option that organisations can just do that bare minimum to comply with the regulation. But that's not enough if we're trying to decarbonise and we're trying to accelerate the rate of decarbonisation. So my question is, well, what could they be doing? How do we get organisations to look at this strategically? So how are they managing the risks and opportunities to really embody sustainability and decarbonisation within their operation? And what I came down to my research is looking at that role of agency. So that's sort of the end point where we'll get to, that role of cognition and agency. But I'm going to take you through the journey that I went through to get to that point. So the research problem I was looking at was looking at best practice carbon management and what are the areas of capability development within organisations that will promote that internal decarbonisation in response to climate-driven market change. And I think most of you aren't from a business background, you're primarily biological sciences. So obviously I'm sure it's the same when you're doing a PhD, you have to come up with a theoretical perspective, and it's the same within business. So the theoretical perspective I used to examine my research problem was called the dynamic capabilities view. And this is a very well-known theory within strategy literature. So essentially what it does is it says that it's not just the resources of an organisation which will promote success. They said that might be fine in a stable market, but in a market which is decarbonising, it's obviously far from stable. So in a market that's dynamic and changing, what the key to success is these dynamic capabilities, which are capabilities that enable it to adapt and change. So how does it use those resources it's got? How does it make connections and research and R&D and embody that knowledge and transfer that knowledge internally to be able to change? So essentially, if you can keep that in your mind, we're looking at capabilities that enable change within organisations. That's primarily the perspective that underpinned my research. So I went about and I took a qualitative approach. So I looked at 4 case studies from 2 contrasting sectors. So I had 2 energy utilities which were vertically integrated. So they looked at, so they had generation assets, they had a retail arm, they also had gas supply business. They were both Australian based, and they were sector dominant organisations. And at the same time, I contrasted these and also examined 2 universities. So they were research intensive universities, they were both top universities. So we're trying to get a real contrast into, we've got one sector which is hugely emission intensive in terms of its scope 1 emissions, and we've got another sector which has relatively low scope 1 emissions but different drivers for engaging in decarbonisation and that sort of sustainability initiatives. So I went into these companies and I did a series of interviews. We call them elite interviews, so they weren't just interviewing anyone within the organisation, they're primarily just looking at people who dealt with sustainability or carbon management, and that was their primary role. So, so the numbers of interviewees changed between companies depending on how the companies managed their sustainability. And then we also looked at documentary evidence, so company reports, internal documents if they were supplied, and then observations. And we used a package called NVivo, which I'm assuming you all use as well, for data storage. And then I hand-coded the data from a mix of prescribed and emergent themes. So I won't leave this one on for too long, but it's just a comparison of the different case study companies. So, if we look at part one of the study, was looking at best practice carbon management and thinking, well, what would it look like if we were looking at it from a theoretical perspective? So I went and did a systematic review of literature which had been written on carbon management and sustainability, and we came up with 8 key areas or attributes within organisations that can promote best practice carbon management. And again, it's not from that highly prescriptive, ISO 40001, or it's probably changed by now. It's thinking about key areas where organisations need to work at, because organisations are so different and their markets are so different, and you can't actually give them one best answer, but you can say these are key areas where you should be looking at to promote carbon management. And you can sort of divide them in half almost. So you've got sort of 4, which are really typical areas that companies should be looking at, and they're fairly operational. But then those are quite commonly within models. But there was another 4 areas that came out of the literature which were more strategic. So it's fine to say, your organisation needs to comply, we need to monitor what they're doing before we can work out a compliance and reporting, we can set targets for management. But then if we're actually really trying to create change, it's these other areas about aligning your strategic intent of an organisation, supporting it with the appropriate corporate values, and creating that environment where you can share knowledge that will progress the carbon management within organisations. So this was done before we went out and did our data, or I went out and did my data collection, not the royal we. So what I found when I went and did the data collection was all the companies had, to some extent, adopted the attributes of best practice carbon management. But each company differed in its optimisation of the strategies that it was using. And so this, we're thinking, how did this come about? And it really comes down to, managerial perception of the internal and external factors, that where they put the most emphasis on the development of capabilities. So we had the 2 electricity companies, which I'll go on to the next slide because this shows it a bit better. So we've got those attributes that we had in the model, and then we looked at what was happening in each of the companies, to electricity, to university, and through that analysis of interviews and other data that was collected, we could rank as to where they were putting the emphasis. And it actually aligns really well with what the overall strategy of these different organisations were. So within our electricity companies, and to a certain extent was the same within our universities, so if we looked at case study 1, this was a company which had quite a large standalone sustainability and corporate responsibility area. And then they worked really hard to engage stakeholders and to also internal stakeholders, so not just external, but your internal stakeholders as well. So that was what came out, and it ranked number 1. And then that is really aligned with the fact that it was then incorporated into their strategy and supported by their culture and values. But if we look at what was happening in the second electricity company, we can see that it's, more of it was around strategy, target setting, and a lesser amount to stakeholder engagement. And I think that came down to the fact that that company had gone through a process a long time ago where they decided to embed sustainability within all their areas. But it had happened, say, 8 to 10 years before this had happened. And then it had come under some financial issues with the company. And I think the whole priority that was given to sustainability and decarbonisation was really sort of watered down over time. So they were almost getting back to that bare bones of what you'd expect, looking at how it fitted with strategy, because it was all about keeping the company afloat, and then looking at that more proceduralised target setting to try and promote action. And with the universities, I think this is really interesting. The fact that knowledge creation and sharing ranked so highly in both universities. So where they were putting their resources, how they were creating that decarbonisation and best practice carbon management was associated with what it comes down to, what a university is. It's here to create knowledge and change. So we'll see that come out in the next couple of slides when we look at the drivers. So that was part two. So we looked at what the organisations were doing, but now we wanted to also understand both why they were doing it and why they weren't doing it, so what were the barriers. And when we looked at the drivers from both sectors, both the electricity sectors and the university sector, we found that the majority of drivers came from internal sources. Now perhaps you could say, yeah, that was probably expected within the university sector because it doesn't have a huge amount of Scope 1 emissions. They're not heavily reliant on regulations to change. But it was reasonably unexpected for the electricity sector. Because if you think about the electricity sector and when you think about decarbonisation, you'd mostly think it would be associated with regulatory schemes that were out there. But that wasn't what was coming through. What we were seeing was a lot more of the drivers came from internally identified opportunities from a strategic perspective, very strong leadership from the CEO level and down, and an alignment of culture and values. So if we then look at the university sector, once again, if we go back to that knowledge creation and supporting research, we've got some opportunity, but then
not just financial, but environmental and social. And that is actually, through our research, was shown to be done within the university sector. So they might have projects which are obviously quite capital intensive if you're looking at putting some solar PVs and looking at investing in different initiatives to create behavioural change and things like that. Obviously they have a financial payback, but it might not necessarily be enough to get that project over the line if you're purely looking at it from a dollars perspective. But what they could do is look at it and say, yes, but we get this benefit for branding, we get this benefit for student engagement, we get this benefit for research, and we get publication as well. So there was these whole other aspects of value that could be identified and were identified within the universities, which didn't have the electricity utilities just didn't seem to be able to identify. And I know they're completely different contexts, but I still think that valuation of change in decarbonisation, I still think there's a wider perspective or wider conceptualisation of value that can be taken within those sort of companies. But obviously the universities were also in a better position because the scale of investment required is a lot smaller than what is happening in the electricity utilities. Not a financial advantage that I spoke about, and secondary benefits. But if we looked at what was happening in the energy sector, they were talking about things that were helping them progress what they were doing. So one of them, you looked at things about creating that long-term relationship, which does sort of link you with that value creation. But a lot of it was thinking about where the market is going. And so, they've identified that customers are changing. What customers want is changing. So they do need to evolve to promote and to provide access to new areas of distributed energy and storage and that type of thing. That to take into account these drivers which we're identifying through internal and external drivers, these capabilities were then developed within the organisations which would then promote action. So, and these capabilities are things like knowledge creation, or are in areas, things like the way they develop systems, their technological investments, their ability to create competitive positions, clearly within my case study number 1. So we have these capabilities which are developed to do with sort of seeing the drivers and acting on the drivers. I just want to cover the barriers as well, because we have these drivers that are occurring, but we're still not creating action. So when we looked at the barriers, we found the different stories. So within the electricity sector, 3/4 of the barriers are seen to come from external sources. It's also interesting that when you look at the barriers to drivers for the electricity sector, it's sort of 50-50. When you look at the university sector, there was sort of 80% drivers, 20% barriers. So the electricity companies are in a lot harder time trying to actually make progress in this area. And the top driver, so we're thinking most of the drivers are coming from external, but the top driver was uncertainty. So uncertainty in the electricity sector came up as 50% of the drivers came back to showing that uncertainty was the key barrier to the electricity sector creating action. And it was only about 10%. So although we've got progress being made and investments being made in the electricity sector, they're just not actually able to decarbonise. So this is a quote from one of the case study companies. So they say they're trying to maximise the benefit to stakeholders in the short term, but they're also trying to manage the risk of being left with great big incumbent assets on our balance sheet that have significant book values, but they'll never be realised because of that unavoidable carbon. So this is a big challenge to them, because when you think about the size of their generation portfolios, to write off assets that large and to actually be able to invest in renewables, it's a massive undertaking for a company to be able to make that financial commitment, particularly if they're very risky on the regulations to fall back on. And so that's what they kept on saying again and again and again. So when you looked at the interviewing responses, they're saying, so the biggest problem we have is political uncertainty, or the uncertainty around schemes. So we have the NGACs, New South Wales gas abatement certificates, come and go. So these are traded certificates. We have the GETS convert, another traded certificate, trying to promote this. So these schemes have come in, they've been in for say 5 years, they've got new schemes coming in, and then we've had the price of the carbon come in, and then be reviewed. And every time we had this change, this cost us sort of millions of dollars. And it was really interesting that one of the companies kept on coming back and saying, it's really fatigued us. We just want it to happen. You know, we put all these processes in, we know how we can do it, we just need the support to keep going. We know, so they know what has to be done. Which is also kind of a surprise, because you think you'd go into these big energy companies and they'd be very anti-climate change, or whatever. It's not the case. They know exactly what needs to happen. It's just they have trouble getting it over the line internally. So now we have to get towards the end. But this is I thought I'd put this diagram up because it shows you exactly where all that uncertainty is coming from. Because if you're not in the working in the companies, it can be difficult to see. So they've got the public. Will they have the demand? Will the demand for energy increase? Will it decrease? What's going to happen over time? We have state government legislation looking at solar energy targets, feed-in tariffs, which change the market dynamics. We've got state-based schemes, so there's schemes that the companies have to comply with on a state base as well as a federal base. They have things like ARENA and CESC funding different projects, but maybe not all projects, creating this sort of market distortion in their eyes. We have these high-level commitments coming in. How will they be implemented? So, and this has been going on. It's not like a one-off thing. This has been going on for 20 years. understand how this theme of uncertainty has come about. So, you know, they say long-term policy certainty is needed for them to invest. You know, uncertainty negatively affects their investments. The inconsistency creates, you know, future uncertainty, and there's risk associated with this. So how are the companies working to minimise the impact of uncertainty? And this is again when we can look at capabilities. So what are they doing? How are they being managed to reduce that uncertainty and enable them to make investments? So in this diagram, I've looked at, you know, we've got your second order themes and first order concepts, and how those sort of come into that aggregate theme of regulatory uncertainty. And then how can they orient their capability development to try and meet those challenges. So then we've got these four key areas that they're looking at. So things like R&D and product development. We've got that theme of stakeholder engagement again, that awareness of what's happening with the environment. We've got, you know, the really important communication aspect. So how is it communicated internally and externally? So how are they saying what their organisation's doing, and how are they creating change through their market sectors? I think industry bodies, think communication with regulators, and that's again linked to that stakeholder engagement as well. And then strategizing. If you've got a future environment which is really unpredictable, how do you work out what the future of technology and demand is? So do the companies have capabilities to do things like forecasting and scenario planning? So which is a capability, the ability to properly scenario plan for the future is a really significant capability for organisations to have. So if we link it back to theory, we can sort of see, well, what do the organisations need to be doing, and what are they doing in terms of capabilities to do with sensing? So we think about working out where the market is going and where that knowledge is. Seizing, how can they take advantage of what they're doing? How can they see, you know, avoid those risks and look at the opportunities? And then how they can reconfigure their organisation. And the organisations that I was looking at, the utilities, are doing a lot. They've got a lot of these capabilities. And that's why the electricity companies are so interesting, because they've almost been forced, because they know that the way they've done business in the past isn't the future. And they know there's a major step change coming, and they have to try and position themselves for it. And to a large extent, they have positioned themselves. They invest in R&D, they've got a lot of industry alliances. They're networking continuously with internally, but still they're not making the changes we need. So, what does this mean? So when I sort of looked at it, and this is where I've ended up with my research and where I'm sort of going now, is trying to understand, is there a threshold to action in terms of that sort of paying versus payback, you know, or can we help them there by overcoming issues with cognitive framing? So if you think about that cognitive framing, it's looking at managerial cognition, which is, you know, the way those sort of mental models that managers use to make decisions. So are they stuck almost in a mental model that says uncertainty prevents us from making investments? And I'll skip through this because I know I'm out of time. But if we go back to those themes I showed you, there was one which kept coming up again and again, and that's they believe the carbon price will return. So they all firmly believe that they will have to decarbonise. They believe the carbon price will return, and they believe it will be relatively soon, probably in the next 5 years. So my question is, if that's the case, if you really believe that the change is coming, then why are you still saying uncertainty prevents change and prevents investment? Because, you know, if you know it's coming, it's not really that uncertain, is it? You might not know the timing exactly, but you know it's coming. So this is where I think I'll I'll leave it for you because I'm thinking that we're running out of time. But if we're looking at that issue of managerial cognition and trying to create the change, my current research is looking at areas which will impact managerial cognition. And it comes down to things like your environmental influences, but it's also those characteristics that are embodied within a manager. So I'd like companies to be more aware about how they're employing their staff, particularly at senior level, how they're educating their staff, how they're promoting that knowledge change. So, is there a process by which regulations can be developed so that they're not purely to look at forcing organisations to comply? Is there consideration done in the way they're developed? Can they interact more, and policymakers interact more with the managers, and to promote the managers having to act on it internally, how to actually embody that knowledge about what the future is versus what's happening within their organisation, so that we can impact those mental models and possibly promote a change in the way they're perceiving the needs of the outcomes. I think that's probably I'm out of time. I've tried to keep it to the half hour.
You've got more time if you want.
Oh, well, there's probably. So if we look at,
This is super interesting.
really?
I'm totally generalising, but it's super interesting to me. So keep going.
Okay,
So
well,
you want.
if we think about our dominant cognitive frame, is that, regulatory future is uncertain, change is expected, but investing too soon, companies won't mind. But if we changed it towards change is coming, irrespective of regulations, then how would that impact the way they make investment decisions and the priority they're giving to investment? And I think this is starting to occur, but it's a very difficult process in terms of putting from the outside trying to look at it. So I had a meeting last Friday with a GM from Very Major Bank, and she said, I've had it for so long. I've had meetings internally, boards, business risk. She said, in the last 12 months, I was fighting people off. We want to manage these projects internally. We want to look at the risks and how to change the organisations. How do we become more sustainable? But it's triggering that change, and it's not to do with anything that's happening in the external environment. It's about what's happened in that internal messaging and having that corporate champion in organisations who will put themselves out there. So, I wish I could give you more, definite solutions to this. I really do. But I thought I'd pop up just a couple of quotes because these come from a very, very senior manager in possibly the largest energy utility. One of the largest energy utilities. So he was basically saying, is there absolute, unanimous, unambiguous, anthropogenic climate change? So look, it's not at 100% mark, but it's probably up in the 90s. And if you think about it from a trading background, when you have something that's up in the 90s, you want to manage that risk. What you don't want is to bury your head in the sand. So anytime there's been avoiding climate policy, it's never going to be sustainable. And this person then moved on to fairly senior government role. So it's, the change is coming, and we just need to now, from my perspective, do more research on how we get Thank you for listening.